Lecture 12 of the Analysis of Mind. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Smalley. The Analysis of Mind by Bertrand Russell. Lecture 12. Belief. Belief, which is our subject today, is the central problem in the analysis of mind. Believing seems the most mental thing we do, the thing most remote from what is done by mere matter. The whole intellectual life consists of beliefs and of the passage from one belief to another by what is called reasoning. Beliefs give knowledge and error. They are the vehicles of truth and falsehood. Psychology, theory of knowledge, and metaphysics revolve about belief, and on the view we take of belief our philosophical outlook largely depends. Before embarking upon the detailed analysis of belief, we shall do well to note certain requisites which any theory must fulfill. 1. Just as words are characterized by meaning, so beliefs are characterized by truth or falsehood. And just as meaning consists in relation to the object meant, so truth and falsehood consist in relation to something that lies outside the belief. You may believe that such and such a horse will win the Derby. The time comes, and your horse wins or does not win. According to the outcome, your belief was true or false. You may believe that 6 times 9 is 56. In this case also there is a fact which makes your belief false. You may believe that America was discovered in 1492, or that it was discovered in 1066. In the one case your belief is true, in the other false. In either case, its truth or falsehood depends upon the actions of Columbus, not upon anything present or under your control. What makes a belief true or false I call a fact. The particular fact that makes a given belief true or false I call its objective, and the relation of the belief to its objective I call the reference, or the objective reference of the belief. Thus, if I believe that Columbus crossed the Atlantic in 1492, the objective of my belief is Columbus's actual voyage, and the reference of my belief is the relation between my belief and the voyage, that relation, namely, in virtue of which the voyage makes my belief true, or in another case false. Reference of beliefs differs from meaning of words in various ways, but especially in the fact that it is of two kinds, true reference and false reference. The truth or falsehood of a belief does not depend upon anything intrinsic to the belief, but upon the nature of its relation to its objective. The intrinsic nature of belief can be treated without reference to what makes it true or false. In the remainder of the present lecture, I shall ignore truth and falsehood, which will be the subject of Lecture 13. It is the intrinsic nature of belief that will concern us today. 2. We must distinguish between believing and what is believed. I may believe that Columbus crossed the Atlantic, that all Cretans are liars, that 2 and 2 are 4, or that 9 times 6 is 56. In all these cases the believing is just the same, and only the contents believed are different. I may remember my breakfast this morning, my lecture last week, or my first sight of New York. In all these cases the feeling of memory belief is just the same, and only what is remembered differs. Exactly similar remarks apply to expectations. Bare assent, memory, and expectation are forms of belief. All three are different from what is believed, and each has a constant character which is independent of what is believed. In Lecture 1 we criticized the analysis of a presentation into act, content, and object. But our analysis of belief contains three very similar elements, namely, the believing, which is believed, and the objective. The objections to the act, in the case of presentations, are not valid against the believing in the case of beliefs, because the believing is an actual experienced feeling, not something postulated like the act. But it is necessary first to complete our preliminary requisites, and then to examine the content of a belief. After that we shall be in a position to return to the question as to what constitutes believing. 3. What is believed and the believing must both consist of present occurrences in the believer, no matter what may be the objective of the belief. Suppose I believe, for example, that Caesar crossed the Rubicon. The objective of my belief is an event which happened long ago, which I never saw and do not remember. This event itself is not in my mind when I believe that it happened. It is not correct to say that I am believing the actual event. What I am believing is something now in my mind, something related to the event, in a way which we shall investigate in Lecture 13. But obviously not to be confounded with the event, since the event is not occurring now, but the believing is. What a man is believing at a given moment is wholly determinate if we know the contents of his mind at that moment. But Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was an historical physical event, which is distinct from the present contents of every present mind. What is believed, however true it may be, is not the actual fact that makes the belief true, but a present event related to the fact. This present event, which is what is believed, I shall call the content of the belief. We have already had occasion to notice the distinction between content and objective in the case of memory beliefs, where the content is "this occurred," and the objective is the past event. 4. Between content and objective there is sometimes a very wide gulf, for example in the case of "Caesar crossed the Rubicon." This gulf may, when it is first perceived, give us a feeling that we cannot really know anything about the outer world. All we can know, it may be said, is what is now in our thoughts. If Caesar and the Rubicon cannot be bodily in our thoughts, it might seem as though we must remain cut off from knowledge of them. I shall not now deal at length with this feeling, since it is necessary first to define knowing, which cannot be done yet. But I will say, as a preliminary answer, that the feeling assumes an ideal of knowing which I believe to be quite mistaken. It assumes, if it is thought out, something like the mystic unity of knower and known. These two are often said to be combined into a unity by the fact of cognition. Hence, when this unity is plainly absent, it may seem as if there were no genuine cognition. For my part, I think such theories and feelings wholly mistaken. I believe knowing to be a very external and complicated relation, incapable of exact definition, dependent upon causal laws, and involving no more unity than there is between a signpost and the town to which it points. I shall return to this question on a later occasion. For the moment these provisional remarks must suffice. 5. The objective reference of a belief is connected with the fact that all or some of the constituents of its content have meaning. If I say, "Caesar conquered Gaul," a person who knows the meaning of the three words composing my statement knows as much as can be known about the nature of the objective which would make my statement true. It is clear that the objective reference of a belief is, in general, in some way derivative from the meanings of the words or images that occur in its content. There are, however, certain complications which must be borne in mind. In the first place, it might be contended that a memory image acquires meaning only through the memory belief, which would seem, at least in the case of memory, to make belief more primitive than the meaning of images. In the second place, it is a very singular thing that meaning, which is single, should generate objective reference, which is dual, namely true and false. This is one of the facts which any theory of belief must explain if it is to be satisfactory. It is now time to leave these preliminary requisites and attempt the analysis of the contents of beliefs. The first thing to notice about what is believed, that is, about the content of a belief, is that it is always complex. We believe that a certain thing has a certain property, or a certain relation to something else, or that it occurred or will occur, in the sense discussed at the end of Lecture 9. Or we may believe that all the members of a certain class have a certain property, or that a certain property sometimes occurs among the members of a class. Or we may believe that if one thing happens, another will happen. For example, if it rains, I shall bring my umbrella. Or we may believe that something does not happen, or did not or will not happen. For example, it won't rain. Or that one of two things must happen. For example, either you withdraw your accusation, or I shall bring a libel action. The catalogue of the sorts of things we may believe is infinite, but all of them are complex. Language sometimes conceals the complexity of a belief. We say that a person believes in God, and it might seem as if God formed the whole content of the belief. But what is really believed is that God exists, which is very far from being simple. Similarly, when a person has a memory image with a memory belief, the belief is "this occurred," in the sense explained in Lecture 9, and "this occurred" is not simple. In like manner, all cases where the content of a belief seems simple at first sight will be found, on examination, to confirm the view that the content is always complex. The content of a belief involves not merely a plurality of constituents, but definite relations between them. It is not determinate when its constituents alone are given. For example, Plato preceded Aristotle and Aristotle preceded Plato are both contents which may be believed, but although they consist of exactly the same constituents, they are different and even incompatible. The content of a belief may consist of words only, or of images only, or of a mixture of the two, or of either or both together with one or more sensations. It must contain at least one constituent which is a word or an image, and it may or may not contain one or more sensations as constituents. Some examples will make these various possibilities clear. We may take first recognition, in either of the forms, "This is of such and such a kind," or "This has occurred before." In either case, present sensation is a constituent. For example, you hear a noise and you say to yourself, "Tram." Here the noise and the word "tram" are both constituents of your belief. There is also a relation between them, expressed by "is" in the proposition, "That is a tram." As soon as your act of recognition is completed by the occurrence of the word "tram," your actions are affected. You hurry if you want the tram, or cease to hurry if you want a bus. In this case, the content of your belief is a sensation, the noise, and a word, "tram," related in a way which may be called predication. The same noise may bring into your mind the visual image of a tram, instead of the word "tram." In this case, your belief consists of a sensation and an image suitably related. Beliefs of this class are what are called judgments of perception. As we saw in Lecture 8, the images associated with a sensation often come with such spontaneity and force that the unsophisticated do not distinguish them from the sensation. It is only the psychologist or the skilled observer who is aware of the large mnemic element that is added to sensation to make perception. It may be objected that what is added consists merely of images without belief. This is no doubt sometimes the case, but is certainly sometimes not the case. It is enough for our purposes to note that it sometimes occurs, and that when it does, the content of our belief consists of a sensation and an image suitably related. In a pure memory belief only images occur, but a mixture of words and images is very common in memory. You have an image of the past occurrence, and you say to yourself, "Yes, that's how it was." Here the image and the words together make up the content of the belief. And when the remembering of an incident has become a habit, it may be purely verbal, and the memory belief may consist of words alone. The more complicated forms of belief tend to consist only of words. Often images of various kinds accompany them, but they are apt to be irrelevant, and to form no part of what is actually believed. For example, in thinking of the solar system, you are likely to have vague images of pictures you have seen of the earth surrounded by clouds, Saturn and his rings, the sun during an eclipse, and so on. But none of these form part of your belief that the planets revolve around the sun in elliptical orbits. The only images that form an actual part of such beliefs are, as a rule, images of words. And images of words, for the reasons considered in Lecture 8, cannot be distinguished with any certainty from sensations, when, as is often, if not usually the case, they are kinesthetic images of pronouncing the words. It is impossible for a belief to consist of sensations alone, except when, as in the case of words, the sensations have associations which make them signs possessed of meaning. The reason is that objective reference is of the essence of belief, and objective reference is derived from meaning. When I speak of a belief consisting partly of sensations and partly of words, I do not mean to deny that the words, when they are not mere images, are sensational, but that they occur as signs, not, so to speak, in their own right. To revert to the noise of the tram. When you hear it and say tram, the noise and the word are both sensations. If you actually pronounce the word, but the noise is part of the fact which makes your belief true, whereas the word is not part of this fact. It is the meaning of the word tram, not the actual word, that forms part of the fact which is the objective of your belief. Thus the word occurs in the belief as a symbol, in virtue of its meaning, whereas the noise enters into both the belief and its objective. It is this that distinguishes the occurrence of words as symbols from the occurrence of sensations in their own right. The objective contains the sensations that occur in their own right, but contains only the meanings of the words that occur as symbols. For the sake of simplicity, we may ignore the cases in which sensations in their own right form part of the content of a belief, and confine ourselves to images and words. We may also omit the cases in which both images and words occur in the content of a belief. Thus we become confined to two cases: a. when the content consists wholly of images; b. when it consists wholly of words. The case of mixed images and words has no special importance, and its omission will do no harm. Let us take in illustration a case of memory. Suppose you are thinking of some familiar room. You may call up an image of it, and in your image the window may be to the left of the door. Without any intrusion of words, you may believe in the correctness of your image. You then have a belief consisting wholly of images, which becomes, when put into words, the window is to the left of the door. You may yourself use these words and proceed to believe them. You thus pass from an image content to the corresponding word content. The content is different in the two cases, but its objective reference is the same. This shows the relation of image beliefs to word beliefs in a very simple case. In more elaborate cases, the relation becomes much less simple. It may be said that even in this very simple case, the objective reference of the word content is not quite the same as that of the image content, that images have a wealth of concrete features which are lost when words are substituted, that the window in the image is not a mere window in the abstract, but a window of a certain shape and size, not merely to the left of the door, but a certain distance to the left, and so on. In reply, it may be admitted at once that there is, as a rule, a certain amount of truth in the objection. But 2 points may be urged to minimize its force. First, images do not, as a rule, have that wealth of concrete detail that would make it impossible to express them fully in words. They are vague and fragmentary. A finite number of words, though perhaps a large number, would exhaust at least their significant features. For, and this is our second point, images enter into the content of a belief through the fact that they are capable of meaning, and their meaning does not, as a rule, have as much complexity as they have. Some of their characteristics are usually devoid of meaning. Thus it may well be possible to extract in words all that has meaning in an image content. In that case, the word content and the image content will have exactly the same objective reference. The content of a belief, when expressed in words, is the same thing, or very nearly the same thing, as what in logic is called a proposition. A proposition is a series of words, or sometimes a single word, expressing the kind of thing that can be asserted or denied. That all men are mortal, that Columbus discovered America, that Charles I died in his bed, that all philosophers are wise, are propositions. Not any series of words is a proposition, but only such series of words as have meaning, or, in our phraseology, objective reference. Given the meanings of separate words and the rules of syntax, the meaning of a proposition is determinate. This is the reason why we can understand a sentence we never heard before. You probably never heard before the proposition that the inhabitants of the Andaman Islands habitually eat stewed hippopotamus for dinner, but there is no difficulty in understanding the proposition. The question of the relation between the meaning of a sentence and the meanings of the separate words is difficult, and I shall not pursue it now. I brought it up solely as being illustrative of the nature of propositions. We may extend the term proposition so as to cover the image contents of beliefs consisting of images. Thus, in the case of remembering a room in which the window is to the left of the door, when we believe the image content, the proposition will consist of the image of the window on the left together with the image of the door on the right. We will distinguish propositions of this kind as image propositions, and propositions in words as word propositions. We may identify propositions in general with the contents of actual and possible beliefs, and we may say that it is propositions that are true or false. In logic, we are concerned with propositions rather than beliefs, since logic is not interested in what people do in fact believe, but only in the conditions which determine the truth or falsehood of possible beliefs. Whenever possible, except when actual beliefs are in question, it is generally a simplification to deal with propositions. It would seem that image propositions are more primitive than word propositions, and may well antedate language. There is no reason why memory images, accompanied by that very simple belief feeling which we decided to be the essence of memory, should not have occurred before language arose. Indeed, it would be rash to assert positively that memory of this sort does not occur among the higher animals. Our more elementary beliefs, notably those that are added to sensation to make perception, often remain at the level of images. For example, most of the visual objects in our neighborhood rouse tactile images. We have a different feeling in looking at a sofa from what we have in looking at a block of marble, and the difference consists chiefly in different stimulation of our tactile imagination. It may be said that the tactile images are merely present, without any accompanying belief, but I think this view, though sometimes correct, derives its plausibility as a general proposition from our thinking of explicit conscious belief only. Most of our beliefs, like most of our wishes, are unconscious, in the sense that we have never told ourselves that we have them. Such beliefs display themselves when the expectations that they arouse fail in any way. For example, if someone puts tea, without milk, into a glass, and you drink it under the impression that it is going to be beer, or if you walk on what appears to be a tiled floor, and it turns out to be a soft carpet made to look like tiles. The shock of surprise on an occasion of this kind makes us aware of the expectations that habitually enter into our perceptions. And such expectations must be classed as beliefs, in spite of the fact that we do not normally take note of them or put them into words. I remember once watching a cock pigeon running over and over again to the edge of a looking-glass to try to wreak vengeance on the particularly obnoxious bird whom he expected to find there, judging by what he saw in the glass. He must have experienced each time the sort of surprise on finding nothing, which is calculated to lead in time to the adoption of Berkeley's theory that objects of sense are only in the mind. His expectation, though not expressed in words, deserved, I think, to be called a belief. I come now to the question, what constitutes believing, as opposed to the content believed. To begin with, there are various different attitudes that may be taken towards the same content. Let us suppose, for the sake of argument, that you have a visual image of your breakfast table. You may expect it while you are dressing in the morning. Remember it as you go to your work. Feel doubt as to its correctness when questioned as to your powers of visualizing. Merely entertain the image, without connecting it with anything external, when you are going to sleep. Desire it if you are hungry, or feel aversion for it if you are ill. Suppose, for the sake of definiteness, that the content is an egg for breakfast. Then you have the following attitudes. I expect there will be an egg for breakfast. I remember there was an egg for breakfast. Was there an egg for breakfast? An egg for breakfast? Well, what of it? I hope there will be an egg for breakfast. I am afraid there will be an egg for breakfast, and it is sure to be bad. I do not suggest that this is a list of all possible attitudes on the subject. I say only that they are different attitudes, all concerned with the one content, an egg for breakfast. These attitudes are not all equally ultimate. Those that involve desire and aversion have occupied us in Lecture 3. For the present, we are only concerned with such as are cognitive. In speaking of memory, we distinguished three kinds of belief directed towards the same content, namely, memory, expectation, and bare assent without any time determination in the belief feeling. But before developing this view, we must examine two other theories which might be held concerning belief, and which, in some ways, would be more in harmony with a behaviorist outlook than the theory I wish to advocate. 1. The first theory to be examined is the view that the differentia of belief consists in its causal efficacy. I do not wish to make any author responsible for this theory. I wish merely to develop it hypothetically so that we may judge of its tenability. We defined the meaning of an image or word by causal efficacy, namely by associations. An image or word acquires meaning, we said, through having the same associations as what it means. We propose hypothetically to define belief by a different kind of causal efficacy, namely efficacy in causing voluntary movements. Voluntary movements are defined as those vital movements which are distinguished from reflexive movements as involving the higher nervous centers. I do not like to distinguish them by means of such notions as consciousness or will, because I do not think these notions, in any definable sense, are always applicable. Moreover, the purpose of the theory we are examining is to be, as far as possible, physiological and behaviorist, and this purpose is not achieved if we introduce such a conception as consciousness or will. Nevertheless, it is necessary for our purpose to find some way of distinguishing between voluntary and reflex movements, since the results would be too paradoxical if we were to say that reflex movements also involve beliefs. According to this definition, a content is said to be believed when it causes us to move. The images aroused are the same if you say to me, "Suppose there were an escaped tiger coming along the street," and if you say to me, "There is an escaped tiger coming along the street." But my actions will be very different in the two cases. In the first, I shall remain calm. In the second, it is possible that I may not. It is suggested by the theory we are considering that this difference of effects constitutes what is meant by saying that in the second case I believe the proposition suggested, while in the first case I do not. According to this view, images or words are believed when they cause bodily movements. I do not think this theory is adequate, but I think it is suggestive of truth, and not so easily refutable as it might appear to be at first sight. It might be objected to the theory that many things which we certainly believe do not call for any bodily movements. I believe that Great Britain is an island, that whales are mammals, that Charles I was executed, and so on, and at first sight it seems obvious that such beliefs, as a rule, do not call for any action on my part. But when we investigate the matter more closely, it becomes more doubtful. To begin with, we must distinguish belief as a mere disposition from actual active belief. We speak as if we always believed that Charles I was executed, but that only means that we are always ready to believe it when the subject comes up. The phenomenon we are concerned to analyze is the active belief, not the permanent disposition. Now, what are the occasions when we actively believe that Charles I was executed? Primarily, examinations, when we perform the bodily movement of writing it down, conversation, when we assert it to display our historical erudition, and political discourses, when we are engaged in showing what Soviet government leads to. In all these cases, bodily movements, writing or speaking, result from our belief. But there remains the belief which merely occurs in thinking. One may set to work to recall some piece of history one has been reading, and what one recalls is believed, although it probably does not cause any bodily movement whatever. It is true that what we believe always may influence action. Suppose I am invited to become King of Georgia. I find the prospect attractive, and go to Cook's to buy a third-class ticket to my new realm. At the last moment I remember Charles I and all the other monarchs who have come to a bad end. I change my mind and walk out without completing the transaction. But such incidents are rare, and cannot constitute the whole of my belief that Charles I was executed. The conclusion seems to be that, although a belief always may influence action, if it becomes relevant to a practical issue, it often exists actively, not as a mere disposition, without producing any voluntary movement whatever. If this is true, we cannot define belief by the effect on voluntary movements. There is another, more theoretical, ground for rejecting the view we are examining. It is clear that a proposition can be either believed or merely considered, and that the content is the same in both cases. We can expect an egg for breakfast, or merely entertain the supposition that there may be an egg for breakfast. A moment ago I considered the possibility of being invited to become king of Georgia, but I do not believe that this will happen. Now, it seems clear that, since believing and considering have different effects, if one produces bodily movements, while the other does not, there must be some intrinsic difference between believing and considering, for if they were precisely similar, their effects would also be precisely similar. We have seen that the difference between believing a given proposition and merely considering it does not lie in the content. Therefore, there must be in one case or in both something additional to the content which distinguishes the occurrence of a belief from the occurrence of a mere consideration of the same content. So far as the theoretical argument goes, this additional element may exist only in belief, or only in consideration, or there may be one sort of additional element in the case of belief, and another in the case of consideration. This brings us to the second view which we have to examine. 1. The theory which we have now to consider regards belief as belonging to every idea which is entertained, except in so far as some positive counteracting force interferes. In this view, belief is not a positive phenomenon, though doubt and disbelief are so. What we call belief, according to this hypothesis, involves only the appropriate content, which will have the effects characteristic of belief, unless something else operating simultaneously inhibits them. James quotes with approval, though inaccurately, a passage from Spinoza embodying this view. Quote, "Let us conceive a boy imagining to himself a horse, and taking note of nothing else. As this imagination involves the existence of the horse, and the boy has no perception which annuls its existence, he will necessarily contemplate the horse as present, nor will he be able to doubt of its existence, however little certain of it he may be. I deny that a man in so far as he imagines affirms nothing. For what is it to imagine a winged horse but to affirm that the horse has wings? For if the mind had nothing before it but the winged horse, it would contemplate the same as present, would have no cause to doubt of its existence, nor any power of dissenting from its existence, unless the imagination of the winged horse were joined to an idea which contradicted its existence." Unquote. To this doctrine James entirely assents, adding in italics, "Any object which remains uncontradicted is ipso facto believed and posited as absolute reality." If this view is correct, it follows, though James does not draw the inference, that there is no need of any specific feeling called belief, and that the mere existence of images yields all that is required. The state of mind in which we merely consider a proposition, without believing or disbelieving it, will then appear as a sophisticated product, the result of some rival force adding to the image proposition a positive feeling which may be called suspense or non-belief, a feeling which may be compared to that of a man about to run a race, waiting for the signal. Such a man, though not moving, is in a very different condition from that of a man quietly at rest. And so the man who is considering a proposition without believing it will be in a state of tension, restraining the natural tendency to act upon the proposition which he would display if nothing interfered. In this view, belief primarily consists merely in the existence of the appropriate images, without any counteracting forces. There is a great deal to be said in favor of this view, and I have some hesitation in regarding it as inadequate. It fits admirably with the phenomena of dreams and hallucinatory images, and it is recommended by the way in which it accords with mental development. Doubt, suspense of judgment, and disbelief all seem later and more complex than a whole unreflecting assent. Belief as a positive phenomenon, if it exists, may be regarded in this view as a product of doubt, a decision after debate, an acceptance not merely of this, but of this rather than that. It is not difficult to suppose that a dog has images, possible olfactory, of his absent master, or of the rabbit that he dreams of hunting. But it is very difficult to suppose that he can entertain mere imagination images to which no assent is given. I think it must be conceded that a mere image, without the addition of any positive feeling that could be called belief, is apt to have a certain dynamic power, and in this sense an uncombated image has the force of a belief. But although this may be true, it accounts only for some of the simplest phenomena in the region of belief. It will not, for example, explain memory. Nor can it explain beliefs which do not issue in any proximate action, such as those of mathematics. I conclude, therefore, that there must be belief feelings of the same order as those of doubt or disbelief, although phenomena closely analogous to those of belief can be produced by mere uncontradicted images. 3. It comes now to the view of belief which I wish to advocate. It seems to me that there are at least three kinds of belief, namely, memory, expectation, and bare assent. Each of these I regard as constituted by a certain feeling or complex of sensations attached to the content believed. We may illustrate by an example. Suppose I am believing, by means of images, not words, that it will rain. We have here two interrelated elements, namely the content and the expectation. The content consists of images of, say, the visual appearance of rain, the feeling of wetness, the patter of drops, interrelated, roughly, as the sensations would be if it were raining. Thus the content is a complex fact composed of images. Exactly the same content may enter into the memory, "it was raining," or the assent, "rain occurs." The difference of these cases from each other, and from expectation, does not lie in the content. The difference lies in the nature of the belief feeling. I personally do not profess to be able to analyze the sensations constituting respectively memory, expectation, and assent, but I am not prepared to say that they cannot be analyzed. There may be other belief feelings, for example, in disjunction and implication, also a disbelief feeling. It is not enough that the content and the belief feeling should coexist. It is necessary that there should be a specific relation between them, of the sort expressed by saying that the content is what is believed. If this were not obvious, it could be made plain by an argument. If the mere coexistence of the content and the belief feeling sufficed, whenever we were having, say, a memory feeling, we should be remembering any proposition which came into our minds at the same time. But this is not the case, since we may simultaneously remember one proposition and merely consider another. We may sum up our analysis, in the case of bare assent, to a proposition not expressed in words, as follows. A. We have a proposition, consisting of interrelated images, and possibly partly of sensations. B. We have the feeling of assent, which is presumably a complex sensation demanding analysis. C. We have a relation, actually subsisting, between the assent and the proposition, such as is expressed by saying that the proposition in question is what is assented to. For other forms of belief feeling or of content, we have only to make the necessary substitutions in this analysis. If we are right in our analysis of belief, the use of words in expressing beliefs is apt to be misleading. There is no way of distinguishing in words between a memory and an assent to a proposition about the past. "I ate my breakfast," and "Caesar conquered Gaul," have the same verbal form, though, assuming that I remember my breakfast, they express occurrences which are psychologically very different. In the one case, what happens is that I remember the content, eating my breakfast. In the other case, I assent to the content, Caesar's conquest of Gaul occurred. In the latter case, but not in the former, the pastness is part of the content believed. Exactly similar remarks apply to the difference between expectation, such as we have when waiting for the thunder after a flash of lightning, and assent to a proposition about the future, such as we have in all the usual cases of inferential knowledge as to what will occur. I think this difficulty in the verbal expression of the temporal aspects of beliefs is one among the causes which have hampered philosophy in the consideration of time. The view of belief which I have been advocating contains little that is novel except the distinction of kinds of belief feeling, such as memory and expectation. Thus James says, "Everyone knows the difference between imagining a thing and believing in its existence, between supposing a proposition and acquiescing in its truth. In its inner nature, belief, or the sense of reality, is a sort of feeling more allied to the emotions than to anything else." He proceeds to point out that drunkenness, and still more nitrous oxide intoxication, will heighten the sense of belief. In the latter case, he says, a man's very soul may sweat with conviction, and he be all the time utterly unable to say what he is convinced of. It would seem that, in such cases, the feeling of belief exists unattached, without its usual relation to a content believed, just as the feeling of familiarity may sometimes occur without being related to any definite familiar object. The feeling of belief, when it occurs in this separated heightened form, generally leads us to look for a content to which to attach it. Much of what passes for revelation or mystic insight probably comes in this way. The belief feeling, in abnormal strength, attaches itself more or less accidentally to some content which we happen to think of at the appropriate moment. But this is only a speculation, upon which I do not wish to lay too much stress. End of Lecture 12. Recording by Lee Smalley. Lecture 13 of the Analysis of Mind. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Analysis of Mind by Bertrand Russell. Lecture 13, Truth and Falsehood. The definition of truth and falsehood, which is our topic today, lies strictly outside our general subject, namely the analysis of mind. From the psychological standpoint, there may be different kinds of belief, and different degrees of certainty, but there cannot be any purely psychological means of distinguishing between true and false beliefs. A belief is rendered true or false by relation to a fact, which may lie outside the experience of the person entertaining the belief. Truth and falsehood, except in the case of beliefs about our own minds, depend upon the relations of mental occurrences to outside things, and thus take us beyond the analysis of mental occurrences as they are in themselves. Nevertheless, we can hardly avoid the consideration of truth and falsehood. We wish to believe that our beliefs, sometimes at least, yield knowledge, and a belief does not yield knowledge unless it is true. The question whether our minds are instruments of knowledge, and if so, in what sense, is so vital that any suggested analysis of mind must be examined in relation to this question. To ignore this question would be like describing a chronometer without regard to its accuracy as a timekeeper, or as a thermometer without mentioning the fact that it measures temperature. Many difficult questions arise in connection with knowledge. It is difficult to define knowledge, difficult to decide whether we have any knowledge, and difficult, even if it is conceded that we sometimes have knowledge, to discover whether we can ever know that we have knowledge in this or that particular case. I shall divide the discussion into 4 parts. 1. We may regard knowledge from a behaviorist standpoint, as exhibited in a certain kind of response to the environment. This response must have some characteristics which it shares with those of scientific instruments, but must also have others that are peculiar to knowledge. We shall find that this point of view is important, but not exhaustive of the nature of knowledge. 2. We may hold that the beliefs that constitute knowledge are distinguished from such as are erroneous or uncertain by properties which are intrinsic either to single beliefs or to systems of beliefs, being in either case discoverable without reference to outside fact. Views of this kind have been widely held among philosophers, but we shall find no reason to accept them. 3. We believe that some beliefs are true and some false. This raises the problem of verifiability. Are there any circumstances which can justifiably give us an unusual degree of certainty that such and such a belief is true? It is obvious that there are circumstances which in fact cause a certainty of this sort, and we wish to learn what we can from examining these circumstances. 4. Finally, there is the formal problem of defining truth and falsehood, and deriving the objective reference of a proposition from the meanings of its component words. We will consider these 4 problems in succession. 1. We may regard a human being as an instrument which makes various responses to various stimuli. If we observe these responses from outside, we shall regard them as showing knowledge when they display 2 characteristics: accuracy and appropriateness. These 2 are quite distinct, and even sometimes incompatible. If I am being pursued by a tiger, accuracy is furthered by turning round to look at him, but appropriateness by running away without making any search for further knowledge of the beast. I shall return to the question of appropriateness later. For the present it is accuracy that I wish to consider. When we are viewing a man from the outside, it is not his beliefs but his bodily movements that we can observe. His knowledge must be inferred from his bodily movements, and especially from what he says and writes. For the present we may ignore beliefs, and regard a man's knowledge as actually consisting in what he says and does. That is to say, we will construct as far as possible a purely behavioristic account of truth and falsehood. If you ask a boy, "What is twice two?" and the boy says 4, you take that as prima facie evidence that the boy knows what twice 2 is. But if you go on to ask what is twice 3, twice 4, twice 5, and so on, and the boy always answers 4, you come to the conclusion that he knows nothing about it. Exactly similar remarks apply to scientific instruments. I know a certain weathercock which has the pessimistic habit of always pointing to the northeast. If you were to see it first on a cold March day, you would think it an excellent weathercock, but with the first warm day of spring your confidence would be shaken. The boy and the weathercock have the same defect. They do not vary their response when the stimulus is varied. A good instrument, or a person with much knowledge, will give different responses to stimuli which differ in relevant ways. This is the first point in defining accuracy of response. We will now assume another boy, who also, when you first question him, asserts that twice 2 is 4. But with this boy, instead of asking him different questions, you make a practice of asking him the same question every day at breakfast. You find that he says 5 or 6 or 7, or any other number at random, and you conclude that he also does not know what twice 2 is, though by good luck he answered right the first time. This boy is like a weathercock which, instead of being stuck fast, is always going round and round, changing without any change of wind. This boy and weathercock have the opposite defect to that of the previous pair. They give different responses to stimuli which do not differ in any relevant way. We already had occasion to consider the definition of accuracy. Omitting some of the niceties of our previous discussion, we may say that an instrument is accurate when it avoids the defects of the two boys and weathercocks, that is to say when a. It gives different responses to stimuli which differ in relevant ways. b. It gives the same response to stimuli which do not differ in relevant ways. What are relevant ways depends upon the nature and purpose of the instrument. In the case of a weathercock, the direction of the wind is relevant, but not its strength. In the case of the boy, the meaning of the words of your question is relevant, but not the loudness of your voice, or whether you are his father or his schoolmaster. If, however, you were a boy of his own age, that would be relevant, and the appropriate response would be different. It is clear that knowledge is displayed by accuracy of response to certain kinds of stimuli, e.g., examinations. Can we say, conversely, that it consists wholly of such accuracy of response? I do not think we can, but we can go a certain distance in this direction. For this purpose we must define more carefully the kind of accuracy and the kind of response that may be expected where there is knowledge. From our present point of view, it is difficult to exclude perception from knowledge. At any rate, knowledge is displayed by actions based upon perception. A bird flying among trees avoids bumping into their branches. Its avoidance is a response to visual sensations. This response has the characteristic of accuracy in the main, and leads us to say that the bird knows, by sight, what objects are in its neighborhood. For a behaviorist, this must certainly count as knowledge, however it may be viewed by analytic psychology. In this case, what is known, roughly, is the stimulus, but in more advanced knowledge the stimulus and what is known become different. For example, you look in your calendar and find that Easter will be early next year. Here the stimulus is the calendar, whereas the response concerns the future. Even this can be paralleled among instruments. The behavior of the barometer has a present stimulus but foretells the future, so that the barometer might be said, in a sense, to know the future. However that may be, the point I am emphasizing as regards knowledge is that what is known may be quite different from the stimulus, and no part of the cause of the knowledge response. It is only in sense knowledge that the stimulus and what is known are, with qualifications, identifiable. In knowledge of the future, it is obvious that they are totally distinct, since otherwise the response would precede the stimulus. In abstract knowledge also they are distinct, since abstract facts have no date. In knowledge of the past they are complications, which we must briefly examine. Every form of memory will be, from our present point of view, in one sense a delayed response. But this phrase does not quite clearly express what is meant. If you light a fuse and connect it with a heap of dynamite, the explosion of the dynamite may be spoken of, in a sense, as a delayed response to your lighting of the fuse. But that only means that it is a somewhat late portion of a continuous process, of which the earlier parts have less emotional interest. This is not the case with habit. A display of habit has two sorts of causes: A, the past occurrences which generated the habit; B, the present occurrence which brings it into play. When you drop a weight on your toe and say what you do say, the habit has been caused by imitation of your undesirable associates, whereas it is brought into play by the dropping of the weight. The great bulk of our knowledge is a habit in this sense. Whenever I am asked when I was born, I reply correctly by mere habit. It would hardly be correct to say that getting born was the stimulus, and that my reply is a delayed response. But in cases of memory this way of speaking would have an element of truth. In an habitual memory, the event remembered was clearly an essential part of the stimulus to the formation of the habit. The present stimulus which brings the habit into play produces a different response from that which it would produce if the habit did not exist. Therefore, the habit enters into the causation of the response, and so do, at one remove, the causes of the habit. It follows that an event remembered is an essential part of the causes of our remembering. In spite, however, of the fact that what is known is sometimes an indispensable part of the cause of the knowledge, this circumstance is, I think, irrelevant to the general question with which we are concerned, namely, what sort of response to what sort of stimulus can be regarded as displaying knowledge. There is one characteristic which the response must have, namely, it must consist of voluntary movements. The need of this characteristic is connected with the characteristic of appropriateness, which I do not wish to consider as yet. For the present I wish only to obtain a clearer idea of the sort of accuracy that a knowledge response must have. It is clear from many instances that accuracy, in other cases, may be purely mechanical. The most complete form of accuracy consists in giving correct answers to questions, an achievement in which calculating machines far surpass human beings. In asking a question of a calculating machine, you must use its language. You must not address it in English, any more than you would address an Englishman in Chinese. But if you address it in the language it understands, it will tell you what is 34521 times 19987, without a moment's hesitation or a hint of inaccuracy. We do not say the machine knows the answer, because it has no purpose of its own in giving the answer. It does not wish to impress you with its cleverness or feel proud of being such a good machine, but as far as mere accuracy goes, the machine leaves nothing to be desired. Accuracy of response is a perfectly clear notion in the case of answers to questions, but in other cases it is much more obscure. We may say generally that an object, whether animate or inanimate, is sensitive to a certain feature of the environment if it behaves differently according to the presence or absence of that feature. Thus iron is sensitive to anything magnetic. But sensitiveness does not constitute knowledge, and knowledge of a fact which is not sensible is not sensitiveness to that fact, as we have seen in distinguishing the fact known from the stimulus. As soon as we pass beyond the simple case of question and answer, the definition of knowledge by means of behavior demands the consideration of purpose. A carrier pigeon flies home, and so we say it knows the way, but if it merely flew to some place at random, we should not say that it knew the way to that place, any more than a stone rolling downhill knows the way to the valley. On the features which distinguish knowledge from accuracy of response in general, not much can be said from a behaviorist point of view without referring to purpose. But but the necessity of something besides accuracy of response may be brought out by the following consideration. Suppose two persons, of whom one believed whatever the other disbelieved, and disbelieved whatever the other believed. So far as accuracy and sensitiveness of response alone are concerned, there would be nothing to choose between these two persons. A thermometer which went down for warm weather and up for cold might be just as accurate as the usual kind, and a person who always believes falsely is just as sensitive an instrument as a person who always believes truly. The observable and practical difference between them would be that the one who always believed falsely would quickly come to a bad end. This illustrates once more that accuracy of response to stimulus does not alone show knowledge, but must be reinforced by appropriateness, that is, suitability for realizing one's purpose. This applies even in the apparently simple case of answering questions. If the purpose of the answers is to deceive, their falsehood, not their truth, will be evidence of knowledge. The proportion of the combination of appropriateness with accuracy in the definition of knowledge is difficult. It seems that both enter in, but that appropriateness is only required as regards the general type of response, not as regards each individual instance. 2. I have so far assumed as unquestionable the view that the truth or falsehood of a belief consists in a relation to a certain fact, namely the objective of the belief. This view has, however, been often questioned. Philosophers have sought some intrinsic criterion by which true and false beliefs could be distinguished. I am afraid their chief reason for this search has been the wish to feel more certainty than seems otherwise possible as to what is true and what is false. If we could discover the truth of a belief by examining its intrinsic characteristics, or those of some collection of beliefs of which it forms part, the pursuit of truth, it is thought, would be a less arduous business than it otherwise appears to be. But the attempts which have been made in this direction are not encouraging. I will take two criteria which have been suggested, namely, 1. Self-evidence, 2. Mutual coherence. If we can show that these are inadequate, we may feel fairly certain that no intrinsic criterion hitherto suggested will suffice to distinguish true from false beliefs. 1. Self-evidence. Some of our beliefs seem to be peculiarly indubitable. One might instance the belief that 2 and 2 are 4, that two things cannot be in the same place at the same time, nor one thing in two places, or that a particular buttercup that we are seeing is yellow. The suggestion we are to examine is that such beliefs have some recognizable quality which secures their truth, and the truth of whatever is deduced from them according to self-evident principles of inference. 2. If this theory is to be logically tenable, self-evidence must not consist merely in the fact that we believe a proposition. We believe that our beliefs are sometimes erroneous, and we wish to be able to select a certain class of beliefs which are never erroneous. If we are to do this, it must be by some mark which belongs only to certain beliefs, not to all. And among those to which it belongs, there must be none that are mutually inconsistent. If, for example, two propositions, P and Q, were self-evident, and it were also self-evident that P and Q could not both be true, that would condemn self-evidence as a guarantee of truth. Again, self-evidence must not be the same thing as the absence of doubt or the presence of complete certainty. If we are completely certain of a proposition, we do not seek a ground to support our belief. If self-evidence is alleged as a ground of belief, that implies that doubt has crept in, and that our self-evident proposition has not wholly resisted the assaults of skepticism. To say that any given person believes some things so firmly that he cannot be made to doubt them is no doubt true. Such beliefs he will be willing to use as premises in reasoning, and to him personally they will seem to have as much evidence as any belief can need. But among the propositions which one man finds indubitable, there will be some that another man finds it quite possible to doubt. It used to seem self-evident that there could not be men at the Antipodes, because they would fall off, or at best grow giddy from standing on their heads. But New Zealanders find the falsehood of this proposition self-evident. Therefore, if self-evidence is a guarantee of truth, our ancestors must have been mistaken in thinking their beliefs about the antipodes self-evident. Meinong meets this difficulty by saying that some beliefs are falsely thought to be self-evident, but in the case of others it is self-evident that they are self-evident, and these are wholly reliable. Even this, however, does not remove the practical risk of error, since we may mistakenly believe it self-evident that a certain belief is self-evident. To remove all risk of error, we shall need an endless series of more and more complicated self-evident beliefs, which cannot possibly be realized in practice. It would seem, therefore, that self-evidence is useless as a practical criterion for ensuring truth. The same result follows from examining instances. If we take the 4 instances mentioned at the beginning of this discussion, we shall find that 3 of them are logical, while the 4th is a judgment of perception. The proposition that 2 and 2 are 4 follows by purely logical deduction from definitions. That means that its truth results not from the properties of objects, but from the meanings of symbols. Now, symbols in mathematics mean what we choose. Thus, the feeling of self-evidence in this case seems explicable by the fact that the whole matter is within our control. I do not wish to assert that this is the whole truth about mathematical propositions, for the question is complicated, and I do not know what the whole truth is. But I do wish to suggest that the feeling of self-evidence in mathematical propositions has to do with the fact that they are concerned with the meanings of symbols, not with properties of the world such as external observation might reveal. Similar considerations apply to the impossibility of a thing being in 2 places at once, or of 2 things being in one place at the same time. These impossibilities result logically, if I am not mistaken, from the definitions of one thing and one place. That is to say, they are not laws of physics, but only part of the intellectual apparatus which we have manufactured for the manipulating physics. Their self-evidence, if this is so, lies merely in the fact that they represent our decision as to the use of words, not a property of physical objects. Judgments of perception, such as "this buttercup is yellow," are in a quite different position from judgments of logic, and their self-evidence must have a different explanation. In order to arrive at the nucleus of such a judgment, we will eliminate, as far as possible, the use of words which take us beyond the present fact, such as buttercup and yellow. The simplest kind of judgment underlying the perception that a buttercup is yellow would seem to be the perception of similarity in 2 colors seen simultaneously. Suppose we are seeing 2 buttercups, and we perceive that their colors are similar. This similarity is a physical fact, not a matter of symbols or words, and it certainly seems to be indubitable in a way that many judgments are not. The first thing to observe in regard to such judgments is that as they stand they are vague. The word "similar" is a vague word, since there are degrees of similarity, and no one can say where similarity ends and dissimilarity begins. It is unlikely that our 2 buttercups have exactly the same color, and if we judged that they had, we should have passed altogether outside the region of self-evidence. To make our proposition more precise, let us suppose that we are also seeing a red rose at the same time. Then we may judge that the colors of the buttercups are more similar to each other than to the color of the rose. This judgment seems more complicated, but has certainly gained in precision. Even now, however, it falls short of complete precision, since similarity is not prima facie measurable, and it would require much discussion to decide what we mean by greater or less similarity. To this process of the pursuit of precision there is strictly no limit. The next thing to observe, although I do not personally doubt that most of our judgments of perception are true, is that it is very difficult to define any class of such instruments which can be known, by its intrinsic quality, to be always exempt from error. Most of our judgments of perception involve correlations, as when we judge that a certain noise is that of a passing cart. Such judgments are all obviously liable to error, since there is no correlation of which we have a right to be certain that it is invariable. Other judgments of perception are derived from recognition, as when we say, "This is a buttercup," or even merely, "This is yellow." All such judgments entail some risk of error, though sometimes perhaps a very small one. Some flowers that look like buttercups are marigolds, and colors that some would call yellow, others might call orange. Our subjective certainty is usually a result of habit, and may lead us astray in circumstances which are unusual in ways of which we are unaware. For such reasons, no form of self-evidence seems to afford an absolute criterion of truth. Nevertheless, it is perhaps true that judgments having a high degree of subjectivity certainly are more apt to be true than other judgments. But if this be the case, it is a result to be demonstrated, not a premise from which to start in defining truth and falsehood. As an initial guarantee, therefore, neither self-evidence nor subjective certainty can be accepted as adequate. 2. Coherence. Coherence as the definition of truth is advocated by idealists, particularly by those who in the main follow Hegel. It is set forth ably in Mr. Joachim's book, The Nature of Truth, Oxford, 1906. According to this view, any set of propositions other than the whole truth can be condemned on purely logical grounds as internally inconsistent. A single proposition, if it is what we should ordinarily call false, contradicts itself irremediably. While it is what we should ordinarily call true, it has implications which compel us to admit other propositions, which in turn lead to others, and so on, until we find ourselves committed to the whole of truth. One might illustrate by a very simple example. If I say, so-and-so is a married man, that is not a self-subsistent proposition. We cannot logically conceive of a universe in which this proposition constituted the whole of truth. There must be also someone who is a married woman, and who is married to the particular man in question. The view we are considering regards everything that can be said about any one object as relative in the same sort of way as, so-and-so is a married man. But everything, according to this view, is relative, not to one or two other things, but to all other things, so that from one bit of truth the whole can be inferred. The fundamental objection to this view is logical, and consists in a criticism of its doctrine as to relations. I shall omit this line of argument, which I have developed elsewhere. For the moment, I will content myself with saying that the powers of logic seem to me very much less than this theory supposes. If it were taken seriously, its advocates ought to profess that any one truth is logically inferable from any other, and that, for example, the fact that Caesar conquered Gaul, if adequately considered, would enable us to discover what the weather will be tomorrow. No such claim is put forward in practice, and the necessity of empirical observation is not denied, but according to the theory it ought to be. Another objection is that no endeavor is made to show that we cannot form a consistent whole composed partly or wholly of false propositions, as in a novel. Leibniz's conception of many possible worlds seems to accord much better with modern logic and with the practical empiricism which is now universal. The attempt to deduce the world by pure thought is attractive, and in former times was largely supposed capable of success. But nowadays most men admit that beliefs must be tested by observation, and not merely by the fact that they harmonize with other beliefs. A consistent fairy tale is a different thing from truth, however elaborate it may be. But to pursue this topic would lead us into difficult technicalities. I shall therefore assume, without further argument, that coherence is not sufficient as a definition of truth. 3. Many difficult problems arise as regards the verifiability of beliefs. We believe various things, and while we believe them we think we know them. But it sometimes turns out that we were mistaken, or at any rate we come to think we were. We must be mistaken either in our previous opinion or in our subsequent recantation. Therefore our beliefs are not all correct, and there are cases of belief which are not cases of knowledge. The question of verifiability is in essence this: can we discover any set of beliefs which are never mistaken, or any test which, when applicable, will always enable us to discriminate between true and false beliefs? Put thus broadly and abstractly, the answer must be negative. There is no way hitherto discovered of wholly eliminating the risk of error, and no infallible criterion. If we believe we have found a criterion, this belief itself may be mistaken. We should be begging the question if we try to test the criterion by applying the criterion to itself. But although the notion of an absolute criterion is chimerical, there may be relative criteria, which increase the probability of truth. Common sense and science hold that there are. Let us see what they have to say. One of the plainest cases of verification, perhaps ultimately the only case, consists in the happening of something expected. You go to the station believing that there will be a train at a certain time. You find the train, you get into it, and it starts at the expected time. This constitutes verification, and is a perfectly definite experience. It is, in a sense, the converse of memory. Instead of having first sensations and then images accompanied by belief, we have first images accompanied by belief and then sensations. Apart from differences as to the time order and the accompanying feelings, the relation between image and sensation is closely similar in the two cases of memory and expectation. It is a relation of similarity, with difference as to causal efficacy. Broadly, the image has the psychological but not the physical effects that the sensation would have. When an image accompanied by an expectation belief is thus succeeded by a sensation which is the meaning of the image, we say that the expectation belief has been verified. The experience of verification in this sense is exceedingly familiar. It happens every time that accustomed activities have results that are not surprising, in eating and walking and talking and all our daily pursuits. But although the experience in question is common, it is not wholly easy to give a theoretical account of it. How do we know that the sensation resembles the previous image? Does the image persist in presence of the sensation so that we can compare the two? And even if some image does persist, how do we know that it is the previous image unchanged? It does not seem as if this line of inquiry offered much hope of a successful issue. It is better, I think, to take a more external and causal view of the relation of expectation to expected occurrence. If the occurrence, when it comes, gives us the feeling of expectedness, and if the expectation beforehand enabled us to act in a way which proves appropriate to the occurrence, that must be held to constitute the maximum of verification. We have first an expectation, then a sensation with the feeling of expectedness related to memory of the expectation. This whole experience, when it occurs, may be defined as verification, and as constituting the truth of the expectation. Appropriate action during the period of expectation may be regarded as additional verification, but is not essential. The whole process may be illustrated by looking up a familiar quotation, finding it in the expected words, and in the expected part of the book. In this case, we can strengthen the verification by writing down beforehand the words which we expect to find. I think all verification is ultimately of the above sort. We verify a scientific hypothesis indirectly, by deducing consequences as to the future, which subsequent experience confirms. If somebody were to doubt whether Caesar had crossed the Rubicon, verification could only be obtained from the future. We could proceed to display manuscripts to our historical skeptic, in which it was said that Caesar had behaved in this way. We could advance arguments, verifiable by future experience, to prove the antiquity of the manuscript from its texture, color, etc. We could find inscriptions agreeing with the historian on other points, and tending to show his general accuracy. The causal laws which our arguments would assume could be verified by the future occurrence of events inferred by means of them. The existence and persistence of causal laws, it is true, must be regarded as a fortunate accident, and how long it will continue we cannot tell. Meanwhile, verification remains often practically possible, and since it is sometimes possible, we can gradually discover what kinds of beliefs tend to be verified by experience, and what kinds tend to be falsified. To the former kinds we give an increased degree of assent, to the latter kinds a diminished degree. The process is not absolute or infallible, but it has been found capable of sifting beliefs and building up science. It affords no theoretical refutation of the skeptic, whose position must remain logically unassailable. But if complete skepticism is rejected, It gives the practical method by which the system of our beliefs grows gradually towards the unattainable ideal of impeccable knowledge. 4. I come now to the purely formal definition of the truth or falsehood of a belief. For this definition it is necessary first of all to consider the derivation of the objective reference of a proposition from the meanings of its component words or images. Just as a word has meaning, so a proposition has an objective reference. The objective reference of a proposition is a function, in the mathematical sense, of the meanings of its component words. But the objective reference differs from the meaning of a word through the duality of truth and falsehood. You may believe the proposition, "Today is Tuesday," both when in fact today is Tuesday and when today is not Tuesday. If today is not Tuesday, this fact is the objective of your belief that today is Tuesday. But obviously the relation of your belief to the fact is different in this case from what it is in the case when today is Tuesday. We say, metaphorically, that when today is Tuesday, your belief that it is Tuesday points towards the fact, whereas when today is not Tuesday, your belief points away from the fact. Thus, the objective reference of a belief is not determined by the fact alone, but by the direction of the belief towards or away from the fact. If on a Tuesday one man believes that it is Tuesday while another believes that it is not Tuesday, their beliefs have the same objective, namely the fact that it is Tuesday, but the true belief points towards the fact while the false one points away from it. Thus, in order to define the reference of a proposition, we have to take account not only of the objective, but also of the direction of pointing towards the objective in the case of a true proposition, and away from it in the case of a false one. This mode of stating the nature of the objective reference of a proposition is necessitated by the circumstance that there are true and false propositions, but not true and false facts. If today is Tuesday, there is not a false objective, "Today is not Tuesday," which could be the objective of the false belief, "Today is not Tuesday." This is the reason why two beliefs which are each other's contradictories have the same objective. There is, however, a practical inconvenience, namely that we cannot determine the objective reference of a proposition, according to this definition, unless we know whether the proposition is true or false. To avoid this inconvenience, it is better to adopt a slightly different phraseology and say, the meaning of the proposition, "Today is Tuesday," consists in pointing to the fact, "Today is Tuesday," if that is a fact, or away from the fact, "Today is not Tuesday," if that is a fact. The meaning of the proposition, "Today is not Tuesday," will be exactly the opposite. By this hypothetical form we are able to speak of the meaning of a proposition without knowing whether it is true or false. According to this definition, we know the meaning of a proposition when we know what would make it true and what would make it false, even if we do not know whether it is in fact true or false. The meaning of a proposition is derivative from the meanings of its constituent words. Propositions occur in pairs, distinguished in simple cases by the absence or presence of the word not. Two such propositions have the same objective, but opposite meanings. When one is true, the other is false, and when one is false, the other is true. The purely formal definition of truth and falsehood offers little difficulty. What is required is a formal expression of the fact that a proposition is true when it points towards its objective, and false when it points away from it. In very simple cases, we can give a very simple account of this. We can say that true propositions actually resemble their objectives in a way in which false propositions do not. But for this purpose it is necessary to revert to image propositions instead of word propositions. Let us take again the illustration of a memory image of a familiar room, and let us suppose that in the image the window is to the left of the door. If in fact the window is to the left of the door, there is a correspondence between the image and the objective. There is the same relation between the window and the door as between the images of them. The image memory consists of the image of the window to the left of the image of the door. When this is true, the very same relation relates the terms of the objective, namely the window and the door, as relates the images which mean them. In this case the correspondence which constitutes truth is very simple. In the case we have just been considering, The objective consists of two parts with a certain relation, that of left to right, and the proposition consists of images of these parts with the very same relation. The same proposition, if it were false, would have a less simple formal relation to its objective. If the image proposition consists of an image of the window to the left of an image of the door, while in fact the window is not to the left of the door, the proposition does not result from the objective by the mere substitution of images for their prototypes. Thus, in this unusually simple case, we can say that a true proposition corresponds to its objective in a formal sense in which a false proposition does not. Perhaps it may be possible to modify this notion of formal correspondence in such a way as to be more widely applicable, but if so, the modifications required will be by no means slight. The reasons for this must now be considered. To begin with, the simple type of correspondence we have been exhibiting can hardly occur when words are substituted for images, because in word propositions, relations are usually expressed by words, which are not themselves relations. Take such a proposition as Socrates precedes Plato. Here the word precedes is just as solid as the words Socrates and Plato. It means a relation, but is not a relation. Thus the objective which makes our proposition true consists of two terms with a relation between them, whereas our proposition consists of three terms with a relation of order between them. Of course, it would be perfectly possible, theoretically, to indicate a few chosen relations, not by words, but by relations between the other words. Socrates, Plato might be used to mean Socrates precedes Plato. Plato, Socrates might be used to mean Plato was born before Socrates and died after him, and so on. But the possibilities of such a method would be very limited. For aught I know, there may be languages that use it, but they are not among the languages with which I am acquainted. And in any case, in view of the multiplicity of relations that we wish to express, no language could advance far without words for relations. But as soon as we have words for relations, word propositions have necessarily more terms than the facts to which they refer, and cannot therefore correspond so simply with their objectives as some image propositions can. The consideration of negative propositions and negative facts introduces further complications. An image proposition is necessarily positive. We can image the window to the left of the door, or to the right of the door, but we can form no image of the bare negative, the window not to the left of the door. We can disbelieve the image proposition expressed by the window to the left of the door, and our disbelief will be true if the window is not to the left of the door. But we can form no image of the fact that the window is not to the left of the door. Attempts have often been made to deny such negative facts, but for reasons which I have given elsewhere, I believe these attempts to be mistaken, and I shall assume that there are negative facts. Word propositions, like image propositions, are always positive facts. The fact that Socrates precedes Plato is symbolized in English by the fact that the word precedes occurs between the words Socrates and Plato. But we cannot symbolize the fact that Plato does not precede Socrates by not putting the word precedes between Plato and Socrates. A negative fact is not sensible, and language, being intended for communication, has to be sensible. Therefore, we symbolize the fact that Plato does not precede Socrates by putting the words does not precede between Plato and Socrates. We thus obtain a series of words which is just as positive a fact as the series Socrates precedes Plato. The propositions asserting negative facts are themselves positive facts. They are merely different positive facts from those asserting positive facts. We have thus, as regards the opposition of positive and negative, three different sorts of duality, according as we are dealing with facts, image propositions, or word propositions. We have, namely, 1. Positive and negative facts, 2. Image propositions, which may be believed or disbelieved, but do not allow any duality of content corresponding to positive and negative facts. 3. Word propositions, which are always positive facts, but are of two kinds, one verified by a positive objective, the other by a negative objective. Owing to these complications, the simplest type of correspondence is impossible when either negative facts or negative propositions are involved. Even when we confine ourselves to relations between two terms which are both imaged, it may be impossible to form an image proposition in which the relation of the terms is represented by the same relation of the images. Suppose we say, Caesar was 2,000 years before Foch. We express a certain temporal relation between Caesar and Foch, but we cannot allow 2,000 years to elapse between our image of Caesar and our image of Foch. This is perhaps not a fair example, since 2,000 years before is not a direct relation. But take a case where the relation is direct. Say, the sun is brighter than the moon. We can form visual images of sunshine and moonshine, and it may happen that our image of the sunshine is the brighter of the two, but this is by no means either necessary or sufficient. The act of comparison, implied in our judgment, is something more than the mere coexistence of two images, one of which is in fact brighter than the other. It would take us too far from our main topic if we were to go into the question what actually occurs when we make this judgment. Enough has been said to show that the correspondence between the belief and its objective is more complicated in this case than in that of the window to the left of the door, and this was all that had to be proved. In spite of these complications, the general nature of the formal correspondence which makes truth is clear from our instances. In the case of the simpler kind of propositions, namely those that I shall call atomic propositions, where there is only one word expressing a relation, the objective which would verify our proposition, assuming that the word "not" is absent, is obtained by replacing each word by what it means, the word meaning a relation being replaced by this relation among the meanings of the other words. For example, if the proposition is, "Socrates precedes Plato," the objective which verifies it results from replacing the word "Socrates" by Socrates, the word "Plato" by Plato, and the word "precedes" by the relation of preceding between Socrates and Plato. If the result of this process is a fact, the proposition is true; if not, it is false. When our proposition is, "Socrates does not precede Plato," the conditions of truth and falsehood are exactly reversed. More complicated propositions can be dealt with on the same lines. In fact, the purely formal question, which has occupied us in this last section, offers no very formidable difficulties. I do not believe that the above formal theory is untrue, but I do believe that it is inadequate. It does not, for example, throw any light upon our preference for true beliefs rather than false ones. This preference is only explicable by taking account of the causal efficacy of beliefs, and of the greater appropriateness of the responses resulting from true beliefs. But appropriateness depends upon purpose, and purpose thus becomes a vital part of theory of knowledge. End of Lecture 13. Recording by Lee Smalley. Lecture 14 of The Analysis of Mind. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lee Smalley. The Analysis of Mind by Bertrand Russell. Lecture 14, Emotions and Will. Of the two subjects of the present lecture I have nothing original to say, and I am treating them only in order to complete the discussion of my main thesis, namely that all psychic phenomena are built up out of sensations and images alone. Emotions are traditionally regarded by psychologists as a separate class of mental occurrences. I am, of course, not concerned to deny the obvious fact that they have characteristics which make a special investigation of them necessary. What I am concerned with is the analysis of emotions. It is clear that an emotion is essentially complex, and we have to inquire whether it ever contains any non-physiological material not reducible to sensations and images and their relations. Although what specially concerns us is the analysis of emotions, we shall find that the more important topic is the physiological causation of emotions. This is a subject upon which much valuable and exceedingly interesting work has been done, whereas the bare analysis of emotions has proved somewhat barren. In view of the fact that we have defined perceptions, sensations, and images by their physiological causation, it is evident that our problem of the analysis of the emotions is bound up with the problem of their physiological causation. Modern views of the causation of emotions begin with what is called the James Lange theory. James states this view in the following terms. Psychology, Volume 2, page 449. Quote, "Our natural way of thinking about these coarser emotions, grief, fear, rage, love, is that the mental perception of some fact excites the mental affection called the emotion, and that this latter state of mind gives rise to the bodily expression. My theory, on the contrary, is that the bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, and that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion." James's italics. Common sense says, we lose our fortune, are sorry and weep, we meet a bear, are frightened and run, we are insulted by a rival, are angry and strike. The hypothesis here to be defended says that this order of sequence is incorrect, that the one mental state is not immediately induced by the other, that the bodily manifestations must first be interposed between, and that the more rational statement is that we feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, afraid because we tremble, and not that we cry, strike, or tremble because we are sorry, angry, or fearful, as the case may be. Without the bodily states following on the perception, the latter would be purely cognitive in form, pale, colorless, destitute of emotional warmth. Round this hypothesis a very voluminous literature has grown up. The history of its victory over earlier criticism, and its difficulties with the modern experimental work of Sherrington and Cannon, is well told by James R. Angell in an article called, quote, "A Reconsideration of James's Theory of Emotion in the Light of Recent Criticisms," unquote. And note. In this article Angell defends James's theory and, to me, though I speak with diffidence on a question as to which I have little competence, it appears that his defense is on the whole successful. And the note, Psychological Review, 1916. Sherrington, by experiments on dogs, showed that many of the usual marks of emotion were present in their behavior even when, by severing the spinal cord in the lower cervical region, the viscera were cut off from all communication with the brain, except that existing through certain cranial nerves. He mentions the various signs which contributed to indicate the existence of an emotion as lively as the animal had ever shown us before the spinal operation had been made, unquote. He infers that the physiological condition of the viscera cannot be the cause of the emotion displayed under such circumstances, and concludes, quote, "We are forced back toward the likelihood that the visceral expression of emotion is secondary to the cerebral action occurring with the psychical state, ellipsis. We may, with James, accept visceral and organic sensations and the memories and associations of them as contributory to primitive emotion, but we must regard them as reinforcing rather than as initiating the psychosis." Note, quoted by Angell, loc cit. Angell suggests that the display of emotion in such cases may be due to past experience generating habits which would require only the stimulation of cerebral reflex arcs. Rage and some forms of fear, however, may, he thinks, gain expression without the brain. Rage and fear have been especially studied by Cannon, whose work is of the greatest importance. His results are given in his book, Bodily Changes in Pain, Hunger, Fear, and Rage. D. Appleton & Co., 1916. The most interesting part of Cannon's book consists in the investigation of the effects produced by secretion of adrenin. Adrenin is a substance secreted into the blood by the adrenal glands. These are among the ductless glands, the functions of which, both in physiology and in connection with the emotions, have only come to be known during recent years. Cannon found that pain, fear, and rage occurred in circumstances which affected the supply of adrenin, and that an artificial injection of adrenin could, for example, produce all the symptoms of fear. He studied the effects of adrenin on various parts of the body. He found that it causes the pupils to dilate, hairs to stand erect, blood vessels to be constricted, and so on. These effects were still produced if the parts in question were removed from the body and kept alive artificially. Note: Cannon's work is not unconnected with that of Mosso, who maintains, as the result of much experimental work, that the seat of the emotions lies in the sympathetic nervous system. An account of the work of both these men will be found in Goddard's Psychology of the Normal and Subnormal. Keegan, Paul, 1919, Chapter 7 and Appendix. Cannon's chief argument against James is, if I understand him rightly, that similar affections of the viscera may accompany dissimilar emotions, especially fear and rage. Various different emotions make us cry, and therefore it cannot be true to say, as James does, that we feel sorry because we cry, since sometimes we cry when we feel glad. This argument, however, is by no means conclusive against James, because it cannot be shown that there are no viscera differences for different emotions, and indeed it is unlikely that this is the case. As Angell says, loc cit, fear and joy may both cause cardiac palpitation, but in one case we find high tonus of the skeletal muscles, in the other case relaxation of the general sense of weakness. Angell's conclusion, after discussing the experiments of Sherrington and Cannon, is: I would therefore submit that, so far as concerns the critical suggestions by these two psychologists, James's essential contentions are not materially affected. If it were necessary for me to take sides on this question, I should agree with this conclusion, but I think my thesis as to the analysis of emotion can be maintained without coming to a probably premature conclusion upon the doubtful parts of the physiological problem. According to our definitions, if James is right, an emotion may be regarded as involving a confused perception of the viscera concerned in its causation, while if Cannon and Sherrington are right, an emotion involves a confused perception of its external stimulus. This follows from what was said in Lecture 7. We there defined a perception as an appearance, however irregular, of one or more objects external to the brain. And in order to be an appearance of one or more objects, it is only necessary that the occurrence in question should be connected with them by a continuous chain, and should vary when they are varied sufficiently. Thus the question whether a mental occurrence can be called a perception turns upon the question whether anything can be inferred from it as to its causes outside the brain. If such inference is possible, the occurrence in question will come within our definition of a perception, and in that case, according to the definition in Lecture 8, its non-mnemic elements will be sensations. Accordingly, whether emotions are caused by changes in the viscera or by sensible objects, they contain elements which are sensations according to our definition. An emotion in its entirety is, of course, something much more complex than a perception. An emotion is essentially a process, and it will be only what one may call a cross-section of the emotion that will be a perception of a bodily condition according to James, or, in certain cases, of an external object according to his opponents. An emotion in its entirety contains dynamic elements, such as motor impulses, desires, pleasures, and pains. Desires and pleasures and pains, according to the theory adopted in Lecture 3, are characteristics of processes, not separate ingredients. An emotion, rage for example, will be a certain kind of process, consisting of perceptions and, in general, bodily movements. The desires and pleasures and pains involved are properties of this process, not separate items in the stuff of which the emotion is composed. The dynamic elements in an emotion, if we are right in our analysis, contain, from our point of view, no ingredients beyond those contained in the processes considered in Lecture 3. The ingredients of an emotion are only sensations and images and bodily movements succeeding each other according to a certain pattern. With this conclusion, we may leave the emotions and pass to the consideration of the will. The first thing to be defined when we are dealing with will is a voluntary movement. We have already defined vital movements, and we have maintained that, from a behaviorist standpoint, it is impossible to distinguish which among such movements are reflex and which voluntary. Nevertheless, there certainly is a distinction. When we decide in the morning that it is time to get up, our consequent movement is voluntary. The beating of the heart, on the other hand, is involuntary. We can neither cause it nor prevent it by any decision of our own, except indirectly, as, e.g., by drugs. Breathing is intermediate between the two. We normally breathe without the help of the will, but we can alter or stop our breathing if we choose. James, Psychology, chapter 26, maintains that the only distinctive characteristic of a voluntary act is that it involves an idea of the movement to be performed, made up of memory images of the kinesthetic sensations which we had when the same movement occurred on some former occasion. He points out that on this view no movement can be made voluntary unless it has previously occurred involuntarily. Note, Psychology, Volume 2, pages 492 to 493. I see no reason to doubt the correctness of this view. We shall say, then, that movements which are accompanied by kinesthetic sensations tend to be caused by the images of those sensations, and when so caused are called voluntary. Volition, in the emphatic sense, involves something more than voluntary movement. The sort of case I am thinking of is decision after deliberation. Voluntary movements are a part of this, but not the whole. There is, in addition to them, a judgment. This is what I shall do. There is also a sensation of tension during doubt, followed by a different sensation at the moment of deciding. I see no reason whatever to suppose that there is any specifically new ingredient. Sensations and images, with their relations and causal laws, yield all that seems to be wanted for the analysis of the will, together with the fact that kinesthetic images tend to cause the movements with which they are connected. Conflict of desires is of course essential in the causation of the emphatic kind of will. There will be, for a time, kinesthetic images of incompatible movements, followed by the exclusive image of the movement which is said to be willed. This will seem to add no new irreducible ingredient to the analysis of the mind. End of Lecture 14. Recording by Lee Smalley.
Lecture 15 of the Analysis of Mind. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by JackPowell. The Analysis of Mind by Bertrand Russell. Lecture 15. Characteristics of Mental Phenomena. At the end of our journey, it is time to return to the question from which we set out, namely, what is it that characterizes mind as opposed to matter? Or, to state the same question in other terms, how is psychology to be distinguished from physics? The answer provisionally suggested at the outset of our inquiry was that psychology and physics are distinguished by the nature of their causal laws, not by their subject matter. At the same time, we held that there is a certain subject matter, namely images, to which only psychological causal laws are applicable. This subject matter, therefore, we assigned exclusively to psychology. But we found no way of defining images except through their causation. In their intrinsic character, they appeared to have no universal mark by which they could be distinguished from sensations. In this last lecture, I propose to pass in review various suggested methods of distinguishing mind from matter. I shall then briefly sketch the nature of that fundamental science which I believe to be the true metaphysic, in which mind and matter alike are seen to be constructed out of a neutral stuff, whose causal laws have no such duality as that of psychology, but form the basis upon which both physics and psychology are built. In search for the definition of mental phenomena, let us begin with consciousness, which is often thought to be the essence of mind. In the first lecture, I gave various arguments against the view that consciousness is fundamental, but I did not attempt to say what consciousness is. We must find a definition of it if we are to feel secure in deciding that it is not fundamental. It is for the sake of the proof that it is not fundamental that we must now endeavour to decide what it is. Consciousness, by those who regard it as fundamental, is taken to be a character diffused through our mental life, distinct from sensations and images, memories, beliefs and desires, but present in all of them. Dr. Henry Head, in an article which I quoted in Lecture 3, distinguishing sensations from purely physiological occurrences, says, quote, "Sensation in the strict sense of the term demands the existence of consciousness." End quote. This statement, at first sight, is one to which we feel inclined to assent, but I believe we are mistaken if we do so. Sensation is the sort of thing which we may be conscious, but not a thing of which we must be conscious. We have been led in the course of our inquiry to admit unconscious beliefs and unconscious desires. There is, so far as I can see, no class of mental or other occurrences of which we are always conscious whenever they happen. The first thing to notice is that consciousness must be of something. In view of this, I should define consciousness in terms of that relation of an image of a word to an object which we defined in Lecture 11 as meaning. When a sensation is followed by an image which is a copy of it, I think it may be said that the existence of the image constitutes consciousness of the sensation, provided it is accompanied by that sort of belief which, when we reflect upon it, makes us feel that the image is a sign of something other than itself. This is the sort of belief which, in the case of memory, we expressed in the words, "this occurred," or which, in the case of a judgment of perception, makes us believe in qualities correlated with present sensations, as, example, tactile and visual qualities are correlated. The addition of some element of belief seems required, since mere imagination does not involve consciousness of anything, and there can be no consciousness which is not of something. If images alone constituted consciousness of their prototypes, such imagination images as in fact have prototypes would involve consciousness of them. Since this is not the case, an element of belief must be added to the images in defining consciousness. The belief must be of that sort that constitutes objective reference, past or present. An image, together with a belief of this sort concerning it, constitutes, according to our definition, consciousness of the prototype of the image. But when we pass from consciousness of sensations to consciousness of objects of perception, certain further points arise which demand an addition to our definition. A judgment of perception, we may say, consists of a core of sensation, together with associated images, with belief in the present existence of an object to which sensation and images are referred in a way which is difficult to analyze. Perhaps we might say that the belief is not fundamental in any present existence, but is of the nature of an exception. For example, when we see an object, we expect certain sensations to result if we proceed to touch it. Perception, then, will consist of a present sensation together with expectations of future sensations. This, of course, is a reflective analysis, not an account of the way perception appears to unchecked introspection. But all such expectations are liable to be erroneous, since they are based upon correlations which are unusual but not invariable. Any such correlation may mislead us in a particular case. For example, if we try to touch a reflection in a looking glass under the impression that it is real. Since memory is fallible, a similar difficulty arises as regards consciousness of past objects. It would seem odd to say that we can be conscious of a thing which does not or did not exist. The only way to avoid this awkwardness is to add to our definition the proviso that the beliefs involved in consciousness must be true. In the second place, the question arises as to whether we can be conscious of images. If we apply our definition to this case, it seems to demand images of images. In order, for example, to be conscious of an image of a cat, we shall require, according to the letter of the definition, an image which is a copy of our image of the cat, and has this image for its prototype. Now, it hardly seems probable, as a matter of observation, that there are images of images, as opposed to images of sensations. We may meet this difficulty in two ways, either by boldly denying consciousness of images, or by finding a sense in which, by means of a different accompanying belief, an image, instead of meaning its prototype, can mean another image of the same prototype. The first alternative, which denies consciousness of images, has already been discussed when we were dealing with introspection in Lecture 6. We then decided that there must be, in some sense, consciousness of images. According to this second hypothesis, there may be two images of the same prototype, such that one of them means the other, instead of meaning the prototype. It will be remembered that we defined meaning by association. A word or image means an object, we said, when it has the same associations as the object. But this definition must not be interpreted too absolutely. A word or image will not have all the same associations as the object which it means. The word cat may be associated with the word mat, but it would not happen except by accident that a cat would be associated with a mat. And in like manner, an image may have certain associations which its prototype will not have. Example, an association with the word image. When these associations are active, an image means an image, instead of meaning its prototype. If I have had images of a given prototype many times, I can mean one of these, as opposed to the rest, by recollecting the time and place or any other distinctive association of that one occasion. This happens, for example, when a place recalls to us some thought we previously had in that place, so that we remember a thought as opposed to the occurrence to which it referred. Thus, we may say that we think of an image A when we have a similar image B associated with recollections of circumstances connected with A, but not with its prototype or with other images of the same prototype. In this way, we become aware of images without the need of any new store of mental contents, merely by the help of new associations. This theory, so far as I can see, solves the problems of introspective knowledge without requiring heroic measures such as those proposed by Knight Dunlap, whose views we discussed in Lecture 6. According to what we have been saying, sensation itself is not an instance of consciousness, though the immediate memory by which it is apt to be succeeded is so. A sensation which is remembered becomes an object of consciousness as soon as it begins to be remembered, which will normally be almost immediately after its occurrence, if at all. But while it exists, it is not an object of consciousness. If, however, it is part of a perception, say of some familiar person, we may say that the person perceived is an object of consciousness. For in this case, the sensation is a sign of the perceived object in much the same way in which a memory image is a sign of a remembered object. The essential practical function of consciousness and thought is that they enable us to act with reference to what is distant in time or space, even though it is not at present stimulating our senses. This reference to absent objects is possible through association and habit. Actual sensations in themselves are not cases of consciousness, because they do not bring in this reference to what is absent. But their connection with consciousness is very close, both through immediate memory and through the correlations which turn sensations into perceptions. Enough has, I hope, been said to show that consciousness is far too complex and accidental to be taken as the fundamental characteristic of mind. We have seen that belief and images both enter into it. Belief itself, as we saw in an earlier lecture, is complex. Therefore, if any definition of mind is suggested by our analysis of consciousness, images are what would naturally suggest themselves. But since we found that images can only be defined casually, we cannot deal with this suggestion except in connection with the difference between physical and psychological causal laws. I come next to those characteristics of mental phenomena which arise out of mnemic causation. The possibility of action with reference to what is not sensibly present is one of the things that might be held to characterize mind. Let us first take a very elementary example. Suppose you are in a familiar room at night and suddenly the light goes out. You will be able to find your way to the door without much difficulty by means of the picture of the room which you have in your mind. In this case, visual images serve, somewhat imperfectly it is true, the purpose which visual sensations would otherwise serve. The stimulus to the production of visual images is the desire to get out of the room, which, according to what we found in Lecture 3, consists essentially of present sensations and motor impulses caused by them. Again, words heard or read enable you to act with reference to the matters about which they give information. Here, again, a present sensible stimulus, in virtue of habits formed in the past, enables you to act in a manner appropriate to an object which is not sensibly present. The whole essence of the practical efficiency of thought consists in sensitiveness to signs. The sensible presence of A, which is a sign of the present or future existence of B, enables us to act in a manner appropriate to B. Of this, words are the supreme example, since their effects as signs are prodigious, while their intrinsic interest as sensible occurrences on their own account is usually very slight. The operation of signs may or may not be accompanied by consciousness. If a sensible stimulus A calls up an image of B, and we then act with reference to B, we have what may be called consciousness of B. But habit may enable us to act in a manner appropriate to B as soon as A appears, without ever having an image of B. Although A operates as a sign, it operates without the help of consciousness. Broadly speaking, a very familiar sign tends to operate directly in this manner, and the intervention of consciousness marks an imperfectly established habit. The power of acquiring experience, which characterizes men and animals, is an example of the general law that, in mnemic causation, the causal unit is not one event at one time, but two or more events at two or more times, and a burnt child fears the fire. That is to say, the neighbourhood of fire has a different effect upon a child which has had the sensations of burning than upon one which has not. More correctly, the observed effect, when a child which has been burnt is put near a fire, has for its cause not merely the neighbourhood of the fire, but this together with the previous burning. The general formula, when an animal has acquired experience through some event A, is that when B occurs at some future time, the animal to which A has happened acts differently from an animal which A has not happened. Thus A and B together, not either separately, must be regarded as the cause of the animal's behaviour, unless we take account of the effect which A has had in altering the animal's nervous tissue, which is a matter not patent to external observation except under very special circumstances. With this possibility, we are brought back to causal laws, and to the suggestion that many things which seem essentially mental are really neural. Perhaps it is the nerves that acquire experience rather than the mind. If so, the possibility of acquiring experience cannot be used to define mind. Very similar considerations apply to memory, if taken as the essence of mind. A recollection is aroused by something which is happening now, but is different from the effect which the present occurrence would have produced if the recollected event had not occurred. This may be accounted for by the physical effect of the past event on the brain, making it a different instrument from that which would have resulted from a different experience. The causal peculiarities of memory may, therefore, have a physiological explanation. With every special class of mental phenomena, this possibility meets us afresh. If psychology is to be a separate science at all, we must seek a wider ground for its separateness than any that we have been considering hitherto. We have found that consciousness is too narrow to characterize mental phenomena, and that mnemic causation is too wide. I come now to a characteristic which, though difficult to define, comes much nearer to what we require, namely subjectivity. Subjectivity, as a characteristic of mental phenomena, was considered in Lecture 7, in connection with the definition of perception. We there decided that those particulars which constitute the physical world can be collected into sets in two ways. one of which makes a bundle of all those particulars that are appearances of a given thing from different places, while the other makes a bundle of all those particulars which are appearances of different things from a given place. A bundle of this latter sort, at a given time, is called a perspective. Taken throughout a period of time, it is called a biography. Subjectivity is the characteristic of perspectives and biographies, the characteristic of giving the view of the world from a certain place. We saw in Lecture 7 that this characteristic involves none of the other characteristics that are commonly associated with mental phenomena, such as consciousness, experience, and memory. We found, in fact, that it is exhibited by a photographic plate, and, strictly speaking, by any particular taken in conjunction with those which have the same passive place in the sense defined in Lecture 7. The particulars forming one perspective are connected together primarily by simultaneity, those forming one biography, primarily by the existence of direct time relations between them. To these are to be added relations derivable from the laws of perspective. In all this, we are clearly not in the region of psychology, as commonly understood, yet we are also hardly in the region of physics. And the definition of perspectives and biographies, though it does not yet yield anything that would be commonly called mental, is presupposed in mental phenomena. For example, in mnemic causation, the causal unit in mnemic causation, which gives rise to Semon's engram, is the whole of one perspective, not of any perspective, but of a perspective in a place where there is nervous tissue, or at any rate living tissue of some sort. Perception also, as we saw, can only be defined in terms of perspectives. Thus the conception of subjectivity, i.e. of the passive place of a particular, though not alone sufficient enough to define mind, is clearly an essential element in the definition. I have maintained throughout these lectures that the data of psychology do not differ in their intrinsic character from the data of physics. I have maintained that sensations are data for psychology and physics equally, while images, which may be in some sense exclusively psychological data, can only be distinguished from sensations by their correlations, not by what they are in themselves. It is now necessary, however, to examine the notion of a datum, and to obtain, if possible, a definition of this notion. The notion of data is familiar throughout science, and is usually treated by men of science as though it were perfectly clear. Psychologists, on the other hand, find great difficulty in the conception. Data are naturally defined in terms of theory of knowledge. They are those propositions of which the truth is known without demonstration, so that they may be used as premises in proving other propositions. Further, when a proposition which is a datum asserts the existence of something, we say that the something is a datum, as well as the propositions asserting its existence. Thus, those objects of whose existence we become certain through perception are said to be data. There is some difficulty in connecting this epistemological definition of data with our psychological analysis of knowledge, but until such a connection has been effected, we have no right to use the conception data. It is clear, in the first place, that there can be no datum apart from a belief. A sensation which merely comes and goes is not a datum. It only becomes a datum when it is remembered. Similarly, in perception, we do not have a datum unless we have a judgment of perception. In the sense in which objects, as opposed to propositions, are data, it would seem natural to say that those objects of which we are conscious are data. But consciousness, as we have seen, is a complex notion, involving beliefs as well as mnemic phenomena such as are required for perception and memory. It follows that no datum is theoretically indubitable. Since no belief is infallible, it follows that also every datum has a greater or less degree of vagueness, since there is always some vagueness in memory and the meaning of images. Data are not those things of which our consciousness is earliest in time. At every period of life, After we have become capable of thought, some of our beliefs are obtained by inference, while others are not. A belief may pass from either of these classes into the other, and may therefore become, or cease to be, a belief-giving datum. When, in what follows, I speak of data, I do not mean the things of which we feel sure before scientific study begins, but the things which, when science is well advanced, appear as affording grounds for other parts of the science, without themselves being believed on any ground except observation. I assume, that is to say, a trained observer, with an analytic attention, knowing the sort of thing to look for, and the sort of thing that will be important. What he observes is, at the stage of science which he has reached, a datum for his science. It is just as sophisticated and elaborate as the theories which he bases upon it, since only trained habits and much practice enable a man to make the kind of observation that will be scientifically illuminating. Nevertheless, when once it has been observed, belief in it is not based on inference and reasoning, but merely upon its having been seen. In this way, its logical status differs from that of the theories which are proved by its means. In any science other than psychology, the datum is primarily a perception, in which only the sensational core is ultimately and theoretically a datum, though some such accretions as turn the sensation into a perception are practically unavoidable. But if we postulate an ideal observer, he will be able to isolate the sensation and treat this alone as datum. There is, therefore, an important sense in which we may say that, if we analyze as much as we ought, our data, outside psychology, consist of sensations which include within themselves certain spatial and temporal relations. Applying this remark to physiology, we see that the nerves and brain as physical objects are not truly data. They are to be replaced, in the ideal structure of science, by the sensations through which the physiologist is said to perceive them. The passage from these sensations to nerves and brain as physical objects belongs really to the initial stage in the theory of physics, and ought to be placed in the reasoned part, not in the part supposed to be observed. To say we see the nerves is like saying we hear the nightingale. Both are convenient but inaccurate expressions. We hear a sound which we believe to be casually connected with the nightingale, and we see a sight which we believe to be casually connected with a nerve. But in each case it is only the sensation that ought, in strictness, to be called a datum. Now, sensations are certainly among the data of psychology. Therefore, all the data of the physical sciences are also psychological data. It remains to inquire whether all the data of psychology are also data of physical science, and especially of physiology. If we have been right in our analysis of mind, the ultimate data of psychology are only sensations and images and their relations. Beliefs, desires, volitions, and so on appeared to us to be complex phenomena consisting of sensations and images variously interrelated. Thus, apart from certain relations, the occurrences which seem most distinctively mental and furthest removed from physics are, like physical objects, constructed or inferred, not part of the original stock of data in the perfected science. From both ends, therefore, the difference between physical and psychological data is diminished. Is there ultimately no difference? Or do images remain as irreducibly and exclusively psychological? In view of the casual definition of the difference between images and sensations, this brings us to a new question, namely, are the casual laws of psychology different from those of any other science? Or are they really physiological? Certain ambiguities must be removed before this question can be adequately discussed. First, there is the distinction between rough approximate laws and such as appear to be precise and general. I shall return to the former presently. It is the latter that I wish to discuss now. Matter, as defined at the end of Lecture 5, is a logical fiction, invented because it gives a convenient way of stating casual laws. except in cases of perfect regularity in appearances, of which we can have no experience. The actual appearances of a piece of matter are not members of that ideal system of regular appearances which is defined as being the matter in question. But the matter is, after all, inferred from its appearances, which are used to verify physical laws. Thus, insofar as physics is an empirical and verifiable science, it must assume or prove that the inference from appearances to matter is, in general, legitimate, and it must be able to tell us more or less what appearances to expect. It is through this question of verifiability and empirical applicability to experience that we are led to a theory of matter such as I advocate. From the consideration of this question, it results that physics, insofar as it is an empirical science, not a logical fantasy, is concerned with particulars of just the same sort as those with psychology considers under the name of sensations. The casual laws of physics, so interpreted, differ from those of psychology only by the fact that they connect a particular with other appearances in the same piece of matter, rather than with other appearances in the same perspective. That is to say, they group together particulars having the same active place, while psychology groups together those having the same passive place. Some particulars, such as images, have no active place, and therefore belong exclusively to psychology. We can now understand the distinction between physics and psychology. The nerves and brain are matter. Our visual sensations when we look at them may be, and I think are, members of the system constituting irregular appearances of this matter, but are not the whole of the system. Psychology is concerned, inter alia, with our sensations when we see a piece of matter, as opposed to the matter which we see. Assuming, as we must, that our sensations have physical causes, their casual laws are nevertheless radically different from the laws of physics, since the consideration of a single sensation requires the breaking up of the group of which it is a member. When a sensation is used to verify physics, it is used merely as a sign of certain material phenomenon, i.e., a group of particulars of which it is a member. But when it is studied by psychology, it is taken away from that group and put into quite a different context, where it causes images or voluntary movements. It is primarily this different grouping that is characteristic of psychology as opposed to all the physical sciences, including physiology. A secondary difference is that images, which belong to psychology, are not easily to be included among the aspects which constitute a physical thing or piece of matter. There remains, however, an important question, namely, are mental events casually dependent upon physical events in a sense in which the converse dependence does not hold? Before we can discuss the answer to this question, we must first be clear as to what our question means. When given A, it is possible to infer B, but given B, it is not possible to infer A. We say that B is dependent upon A in a sense in which A is not dependent upon B. Stated in logical terms, this amounts to saying that, when we know a many-one relation of A to B, B is dependent upon A in respect of this relation. If the relation is a casual law, we say that B is casually dependent upon A. The illustration that chiefly concerns us is the system of appearances of a physical object. We can, broadly speaking, infer distant appearances from near ones, but not vice versa. All men look alike when they are a mile away. Hence, when we see a man a mile off, we cannot tell what he will look like when he is only a yard away. But when we see him a yard away, we can tell what he will look like a mile away. Thus, the nearer view gives us more valuable information, and the distant view is casually dependent upon it in a sense in which it is not casually dependent upon the distant view. It is this greater casual potency of the near appearance that leads physics to state its casual laws in terms of that system of regular appearances to which the nearest appearances increasingly approximate, and that makes it value information derived from the microscope or telescope. It is clear that our sensations, considered as irregular appearances of physical objects, share the causal dependence belonging to comparatively distant appearances. Therefore, in our sensational life, we are in causal dependence upon physical laws. This, however, is not the most important or interesting part of our question. It is the causation of images that is the vital problem. We have seen that they are subject to mnemic causation, and that mnemic causation may be reducible to ordinary physical causation in nervous tissue. This is the question upon which our attitude must turn towards what may be called materialism. One sense of materialism is the view that all mental phenomena are causally dependent upon physical phenomena in the above defined sense of causal dependence. Whether this is the case or not, I do not profess to know. The question seems to me the same as the question whether mnemic causation is ultimate, which we considered without deciding in Lecture 4, but I think the bulk of the evidence points to the materialistic answer as the more probable. In considering the causal laws of psychology, the distinction between rough generalizations and exact laws is important. There are many rough generalizations in psychology, not only of the sort by which we govern our ordinary behavior to each other, but also of a more nearly scientific kind. Habit and association belong among such laws. I will give an illustration of the kind of law that can be obtained. Suppose a person has frequently experienced A and B in close temporal contiguity. An association will be established so that A, or an image of A, tends to cause an image of B. The question arises, will the association work in either direction, or only from the one which has occurred earlier to the one which has occurred later? In an article by Mr. Wohlgemuth called The Direction of Associations, British Journal of Psychology, Volume 5, Part 4, March 1913, it is claimed to be proved by experiment that insofar as motor memory, i.e. memory of movements, is concerned, association works only from earlier to later, while in visual and auditory memory this is not the case, but the later of two neighbouring experiences may recall the earlier as well as the earlier the later. It is suggested that motor memory is physiological, while visual and auditory memory are more truly psychological. But that is not the point which concerns us in the illustration. The point which concerns us is that a law of association, established by purely psychological observation, is a purely psychological law, and may serve as a sample of what is possible in the way of discovering such laws. It is, however, still no more than a rough generalization, a statistical average. It cannot tell us what will result from a given cause on a given occasion. It is a law of tendency, not a precise and invariable law such as those of physics aim at being. If we wish to pass from the law of habit, stated as a tendency or average, to something more precise and invariable, we seem driven to the nervous system. We can more or less guess how an occurrence produces a change in the brain, and how its repetition gradually produces something analogous to the channel of a river, along which currents flow more easily than in neighbouring paths. We can perceive that in this way, if we had more knowledge, the tendency to habit through repetition might be replaced by a precise account of the effect of each occurrence in bringing about a modification of the sort from which habit would ultimately result. It is such considerations that make students of psychophysiology materialistic in their methods, whatever they may be in their metaphysics. There are, of course, exceptions, such as Professor J.S. Haldane, who maintains that it is theoretically impossible to obtain physiological explanations of physical phenomena, or physical explanations of physiological phenomena. But I think the bulk of expert opinion, in practice, is on the other side. The question whether it is possible to obtain precise causal laws in which the causes are psychological, not material, is one of detailed investigation. I have done what I could to make clear the nature of the question, but I do not believe that it is possible as yet to answer it with any confidence. It seems to be by no means an insoluble question, and we may hope that science will be able to produce sufficient grounds for regarding one answer as much more probable than the other. But for the moment, I do not see how we can come to a decision. I think, however, on grounds of the theory of matter explained in lectures 5 and 7, that an ultimate scientific account of what goes on in the world, if it were ascertainable, would resemble psychology rather than physics in what we found to be the decisive difference between them. I think, that is to say, that such an account would not be content to speak, even formally, as though matter, which is a logical fiction, were the ultimate reality. I think that, if our scientific knowledge were adequate to the task, which it neither is, nor is likely to become, it would exhibit the laws of correlation of the particulars constituting a momentary condition of a material unit, and would state the causal laws of the world in terms of these particulars, not in terms of matter. Causal laws so stated would, I believe, be applicable to psychology and physics equally. The science in which they were stated would succeed in achieving what metaphysics has vainly attempted, namely a unified account of what really happens, wholly true even if not the whole truth, and free from all convenient fictions or unwarrantable assumptions of metaphysical entities. A causal law applicable to particulars would count as a law of physics if it could be stated in terms of those fictitious systems of regular appearances which are matter. If this were not the case, it would count as a law of psychology if one of the particulars were a sensation or an image, i.e., were subject to mnemic causation. I believe that the realizations of the complexity of a material unit and its analysis into constituents analogous to sensations is of the utmost importance to philosophy, and vital for understanding of the relations between mind and matter, between our perceptions and the world which they perceive. It is in this direction, I am convinced, that we must look for the solution of many ancient perplexities. It is probable that the whole science of mental occurrences, especially where its initial definitions are concerned, could be simplified by the development of the fundamental unifying science in which the causal laws of particulars are sought, rather than the causal laws of those systems of particulars that constitute the material units of physics. This fundamental science would cause physics to become derivative, in the sort of way in which theories of the constitution of the atom make chemistry derivative from physics. It would also cause psychology to appear less singular and isolated among sciences. If we are right in this, it is a wrong philosophy of matter which has caused many of the difficulties in the philosophy of mind, difficulties which a right philosophy of matter would cause to disappear. The conclusions at which we have arrived may be summed up as follows. 1. Physics and psychology are not distinguished by their material. Mind and matter alike are logical constructions. The particulars out of which they are constructed, or from which they are inferred, have various relations, some of which are studied by physics, others by psychology. Broadly speaking, physics group particulars by their active places, psychology by their passive places. 2. The two most essential characteristics of the causal laws which would naturally be called psychology are subjectivity and mnemic causation. These are not unconnected, since the causal unit in mnemic causation is the group of particulars having a given passive place at a given time, and it is by this manner of grouping that subjectivity is defined. 3. Habit, memory, and thought are all developments of mnemic causation. It is probable, though not certain, that mnemic causation is derivative from ordinary physical causation in nervous and other tissue. 4. Consciousness is a complex and far from universal characteristic of mental phenomena. 5. Mind is a matter of degree, chiefly exemplified in number and complexity of habits. And 6. All our data, both in physics and psychology, are subject to psychological causal laws, but physical causal laws, at least in traditional physics, can only be stated in terms of matter, which is both inferred and constructed, never a datum. In this respect, psychology is nearer to what actually exists. End of Lecture 15. End of the Analysis of Mind by Bertrand Russell. Recording by JackPowell. www.voice123.com/JackPowell